Hello and welcome. My name is Lexi and here I like to talk about luxury beauty. Today we are taking a look at the new DIOR Backstage palette in 008 Khaki Neutrals. And this is my first Backstage palette. So this is the first time I've purchased one of these. These are made in France. They have 10 grams of product and they have a 6-month shelf life. I have to say they're smaller than I thought they were. I've never actually looked at them before. But yeah, they're a little bit smaller than I expected. Not that they're too small. I think they're actually a good size, but just something to note there. So again, made in France, 6-month shelf life, and this is intended to be kind of like an all-in-one eye palette. So we have a primer here. This is going to be a cream product. There's a top coat, which is going to be a pearly white kind of glitter to give you some sparkle. And then you have a mix of different formulas. So over here, this is going to be a satin. It's called Golden Tan. Then we have another satin in warm gold, a glitter formula in pure gold. Emerald is going to be a metallic. And then down at the bottom row, we have pine green, which is a glitter. You can see it almost looks black. And then a satin in warm brown and another glitter in khaki. So let's swatch these. So here's the primer. I'm going to put this on my hand here so you can kind of see the formula for this. And it is going to be smooth, creamy. It does give some opacity to the lid. I like the primer. I think it's nice. I'm not sure how well it works for all skin tones. So I'd be curious to know what you guys think about that. And let's go ahead and we'll swatch the other 8 down here. So we're going to start off with the top coat and the Golden Tan satin. So here's the top coat. You can see that is definitely going to be a pearly white. You can build it up so you have more of this opaque white glitter, but in general, it does go on a little bit more diffuse with a brush. The Golden Tan is definitely going to have a strong satin shimmer, and it's really more of a golden beige to me. Tan implies a little bit more brown to me. Moving on to the third row, we're starting off with the gold shade, which is warm gold. Oh, hold on, didn't get quite enough green there. And so these shades here, this is our warm gold in satin. You can see again a strong satin finish. This is pure gold in the glitter formula. And I actually think this is more of a beigey shade as well. I don't know. To me, it does not seem gold. And then the emerald here is a metal or metallic shade. And to me, it does not have a very strong metallic vibe to it. I actually think of it more like a satin matte, a little bit more matte actually than the other satins we've looked at. For the bottom row, we're going to start off with the khaki, which is a glitter shade. And you can see, so this one's glitter, the pure gold is glitter. You can see that they definitely don't have, as much of that satin sheen, but they're not glittery either. They're not that sparkly. I'm not sure where they come up with these formula names. But then we have warm brown, which is a satin. You can see that this is not going to be quite as strong of a satin finish as the 2 lighter shades. And then our last shade here is a glitter. This is pine green, and it's going to be a really deep forest green. In certain lighting, it can look almost black. And again, I just don't find the glitter shades to be all that glittery. It's not quite what I expected. The satins are pretty strong satins. The metallic doesn't really look that metallic. Honestly, I would have to say that these formulas, the formula names, in my opinion, are misleading because these really seem more like mattes and some satin mattes with a few satins. I don't really see much glitter aside from in the top coat shade. So let's talk a little bit about these while we go through a few eye looks. So I do have a few eye looks here. The last one, today's eye look, I'm actually using the new Sonia G Fusion eye brushes, and I will have the clips of that in the video for the Fusion eye brushes as well, because those brushes can be used with creams, liquids, or powder. So this will be kind of like a powder demo with it. So, if you are interested in getting more pigment from these eyeshadows, building them up, something like those brushes, something more dense like the Fusion eye brushes would help you accomplish that. So overall, I would have to say that I think this is a nice palette. I do like the idea of including a primer, but again, I don't know how effective that actually is for a variety of skin tones. The primer works fine for me with a lighter skin tone, but thinking about like deeper skin tones, I could see it being potentially too light. The primer does help with adherence of the powders to the shadow and, you know, making them just a touch brighter than they are without the primer. And I have tested that, but it does not seem to help with longevity of the eyeshadows. So if you have oily lids where things crease easily, I don't find this particular primer to be very effective in that regard. The top coat I think is a nice sparkly white shade. Again, if you are going to build this up, you're gonna have some fallout. You know, it's a little bit looser. It's got kind of like a thin glittery texture to it, but the glitter particles are not too gritty feeling. Sometimes you have those like shiny metallic shades and you can feel like the metallic texture of those. This is a little bit creamier than that, yet not really as creamy as you might get from like some of those like duochrome shadows and so forth, where you see a lot of shine and shimmer as well. Moving on to the satins here. Let's talk about the satins in general. We've got the golden tan, the warm gold, and the warm brown. I find that the golden tan and the warm gold have a very strong satin finish, almost metallic. It's very, you know, high shine, high sheen to that. Whereas the warm brown one really looks more matte to me. It does not really, you don't really see much of that luster. So I'm surprised that that one there is labeled as a satin. And then moving on to the glitter formula, you know, the glitter formula in the pure gold shade, you can see a little bit of a shimmer, but honestly, it's very similar to the satin in the warm gold and the golden tan. That kind of finish, it's just not quite as opaque as those. So there's a little bit more opacity in the base for the satins than there is for the glitter, but the finish looks pretty similar. And again, I don't really see too much actual glitter in it, just like a tiny hint of it. So yeah, that's for the pure gold. Now, as for the glitter in the khaki and the pine green, I don't see any glitter particles in mine at all, either in the pan or on swatches. I don't know, like, do other people see glitter in theirs? Because I don't see any in mine whatsoever. They really perform more like a matte shadow. Now, as for the emerald shade, which is your metal or your metallic, again, this one really looks more like a satin matte. It's matte with just a tiny hint of satin, definitely not as strong as the others. Again, as I mentioned, the warm gold and golden tan satin formulas actually have more of a metallic glint to them than this metallic shade in emerald. So it's really just, you know, I find that the names here are a little bit misleading. And I have to say the formulas on here are nice, but they're not stellar. I definitely think that the DIOR formulas in the traditional quints are a better formulation than those in the Backstage palette. I find these to be a little bit drier, a little bit more powdery. And yes, you can definitely get pigment from these. You can build them up. They perform well, but the textural differences are definitely there. And these just don't feel like they are as high of a quality. And, you know, this is going to be a palette that's at a lower price point. So there's definitely a reason for that. The packaging on this is plastic and there is no mirror included with this. So although it is kind of like a, you know, a whole eye palette, you do need like a mirror and so forth to do this. So it's not really something that you're easily gonna like throw in your purse and take with you. So as for the actual shades included in this palette, I think Khaki Neutrals is a good name for this. However, I do wish that there were some, you know, more greens in here. There are definitely some greens. You've got kind of that khaki brownish green. It's kind of like more of a camo green. You've got the emerald shade, which is kind of your mid-tone forest green. And then you have a really deep forest green. But I would have loved to see some lighter greens in here as well. And, you know, you've got the browns, again, going back to the whole khaki thing. I don't love the warm gold shade. It's just a little bit too warm of a gold, but I can see that working really well with these colors. So, you know, I don't mind it being in there, but I would have loved to see some more like olive type tones, maybe like a shimmery olive kind of shade in there, or like a pea green. So just something a little different added in there to increase the greens in there, but like in the lighter family. The greens that they have included here are pretty deep, and I would have loved to see something, you know, a little bit lighter, and perhaps maybe a chartreuse or something. So those are my thoughts on the actual color story. You know, I would say that there's definitely more browns in here and golden browns than there are greens. And I just would have liked to see that balance just a little bit more in the lighter end of the spectrum. So overall, I think it's a nice palette. It is not going to be my favorite of the green palettes that have come out recently. Let's go ahead and move on to some comparisons and we'll talk about those. All right, so here in this box, we have the palette here, the khaki neutrals. And I just outlined this with the Chanel Cielo Waterproof in 56 Khaki Metal. I am just not really loving my Chanel eye pencils, so I've decided to kind of use them for purposes like this. And we're going to go ahead and we're starting off our swatches with the Natasha Denona Mini Gold. This is a great travel size palette. There are 5 shades here, but you do have kind of similar tones. I have to say though, I really love the form of her, like the creamy metallics here, like this gold shade in the center. We're going to do this one vertically here, so you can just kind of see how the color story goes. All right, so you can see that again, we've got kind of those grungy greens, but we're missing the forest greens that you have in the DIOR palette in the Natasha Denona. The Natasha Denona is going to focus more on those like olivey green tones with golds and browns. And again, very beautiful, but I do feel like the color story of this one is pretty different than the khaki neutrals. Next, let's take a look at the Chanel 318 Blurry Green. And this is a great palette. These are going to be similar in texture because we are looking more at like mattes and satin mattes here. And you can see that this part of the color story is going to be very similar to the lower half of the khaki neutrals. So you are going to have a pretty similar color story here. This green might be not quite as blue as the greens here in the DIOR palette, but the browns are going to be pretty similar. And this deeper green here is very similar to the deep pine shade. This one here is DIOR Jungle. So I love the Jungle palette. Now we do have kind of this orangey shade there, which is going to be pretty different. We're going to put this one right up here next to the Backstage palette, but you can see already that these formulas here are going to be a little bit less powdery. They're more pigmented. They're creamier. So let's take a look at how this color story compares. Again, you can see just the drastic pigmentation difference here. These definitely look more powdery and drier in comparison to the DIOR Jungle palette here. And I love this shade. I wish a shade like that had been included. And your closest is probably this one here, which is going to be more brown. But we do have kind of similar colors. This green is going to have a bit more blue in it than that in the Backstage palette. But yeah, it's similar, not the same. So definitely room for both of those, but I do prefer the DIOR Jungle. This is a Viseart Petit Four in Peridot, and we're going to go ahead and swatch this right below Jungle. And then we're going to move on to my other arm and take a look at the Bobbi Brown Jadestone palette as well. And here you can see that these 3 shades are very similar to the lower half of the khaki neutrals. But again, we have kind of that lighter, brighter spring green shade that's missing from the DIOR Backstage. Formula-wise, I have to say I prefer the formula in this Viseart palette over that in the Backstage palette. I just find it to be a little bit drier than the Viseart. This here is the Bobbi Brown Jadestone palette. And I have to say, I think this was a very successful launch from Bobbi Brown for this holiday season. Unfortunately, it is a limited edition palette. I'm just going to take a second and swatch these here. We're going to do top row, bottom row. All right, so this is the Bobbi Brown Jade Stone palette. In comparison with khaki neutrals here, you can see that they definitely have some similar colors. However, I think the Bobbi Brown Jade Stone palette is a better palette. And I think that because the formulas here, they are still going to be a little bit drier than something like the Dior Jungle, but they're not as dry as the Backstage. You can see that you definitely have a variety of finishes here. You've got shimmers, you've got metallics, you've got mattes, you've got satins. And there's a more drastic difference there than there is in the Bobbi Brown than there is in the Dior Backstage. So I feel like that is, you know, better. And Bobbi Brown has more colors as well. So we are looking here at 12 shadows versus 9. And, you know, these are similarly priced. So I think the Bobbi Brown was just a better palette. And I think it's a really great palette that has come out. Again, it is limited edition. Now, another palette, my personal favorite actually is this Tom Ford Velour Khaki, because out of all of these, this would be my favorite formula of the ones here that we've compared. This is new. Whether this is going to be limited edition or permanent, I don't know. I was originally told it was permanent, and then like all of the launches kind of got delayed. We're just going to put this one vertically here. And so I don't know now, you know, word is it might actually be limited edition. Not sure why it hasn't come out yet. But you can see it's a similar color story. You're not going to get as many colors. So for your money, the Bobbi Brown is definitely a better bet. But I do love this Tom Ford Creme formula. I just think it's a very sophisticated formula. And there are just like nuances with the texture that I really enjoy. So this is a personal favorite, but I do think the Bobbi Brown Jade Stone is actually a better deal. And out of all of these that we swatched here, you know, I have to say, you know, this is a really, really great option for any green palette. My personal favorites here, you know, I would have to go with this Bobbi Brown Jade Stone, the Tom Ford. These aren't in order, by the way. The Dior Jungle and the Viseart. I know it's a lot. Those are the ones that I gravitate towards the most. I end up not really using these two quite as much, although I do really like them anytime I use them. The Chanel for me is just, it's deep. You know, there's not a really light color in there, so I usually have to pair that with something else, which is why I tend to gravitate more towards some of these that have like a lighter shade in them. But yeah, those are my thoughts on the Dior Backstage palette. I would have to say if you can find the Bobbi Brown Jade Stone, I would pick that one up instead of the Dior Backstage personally. So I hope these comparisons were helpful. I have to say that overall, this Dior Backstage Khaki Neutrals palette, I think is a really great color, you know, set of combinations and so forth. I still do wish that there was kind of that lighter green in there to kind of balance things out, you know, in the lighter end of the palette. But I am a little disappointed with how dry and similar all of the different textures in the palette look. You know, looking at the names and seeing the different finishes, I feel like the finishes pretty much all look the same, and that was a little bit disappointing. With all of these green palettes that have been coming out recently, I just don't think this is one of the better ones. I think it's a nice choice, but it's just okay. And I would definitely prefer the Bobbi Brown Jade Stone palette to this one. I think it is a better use of your money if you are able to get that one. And, you know, my personal favorites here, I really like some of the other palettes in my collection more, such as the Dior Jungle or the Viseart Peridot. And, you know, I already talked about the Bobbi Brown and the Tom Ford. So I think these are all great options for green palettes. And out of all of the ones that I have, unfortunately, I would put the Dior Backstage palette down at the bottom of my list. So I hope this was helpful. I'd love to know what your thoughts are on the Backstage palettes in general and this one in particular. Let me know if, you know, you've used these in the past, and you know, are the finishes a little bit more exaggerated in other palettes, or do they all kind of look more like this matte finish? So I'd love to know your thoughts and comments down below. And thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you very soon.